Alex Rider. Chapter 15. Hide and Seek. The captain of the Library and Star was normally a nervous man, but right now he was sweating, standing in front of the stateroom door. He tried to compose himself, mopping his forehead and tucking his cap under his arm. He was aware that he might have only a few minutes to live. Herman de Winter was Dutch, unmarried, out of shape, and saving for retirement somewhere for 11 years. Transporting containers all over the world. Never once had he asked what was inside. Never once had he asked what was inside. He knew that in this game, one question could prove fatal. So could failure. And now it was his duty to tell Major Yu that he had failed. He took a deep breath and knocked on the door of the stateroom that Yu occupied on the main deck. Come! The single word sounded cheerful enough, but De Winter had been present the day before. He had smiled as he killed the Afghan refugee. He opened the door. The room was well appointed, with a thick carpet, modern English furniture and soft lighting. Yu was sitting at his desk drinking a cup of tea. There was also a plate of shortbread which De Winter knew was organic and came from high growth. The estate belonging to the Prince of Wales. Good day, Captain. Yu motioned for him to come in. What news do you have for me? De Winter had to force the words into his mouth. I am very sorry to report, Major Yu, that we have been unable to find the boy. You looked surprised. You've been searching for nearly 18 hours. Yes, sir. None of the crew have slept. We spent the whole night searching the ship from top to bottom. Frankly, it's incredible that we haven't found no trace of him. We've used motion detectors and sonic intensifiers. Nothing. Some of the men think the child must have slipped overboard. Of course, we still haven't given up. His voice trailed off. There was nothing more to say, and he knew that making too many excuses would annoy Major Yu all the more. De Winter stood there, waiting for whatever might come. He had once seen Yu shoot a man simply for being late with his tea. He just hoped his own end would be as quick. But to his amazement, Major Yu smiled pleasantly. The boy certainly is trouble. I must say I'm not at all surprised that he's managed to give you the slip. He's quite a character. De Winter blinked. You know him? He asked. Oh, yes. Our paths have crossed once before. But I thought... De Winter frowned. He's just a refugee, a street urchin from Afghanistan. Not at all, Captain. That's what he'd like us to believe. But the truth is, he's unique. His name is Alex Rider. He works for British intelligence. He is what you might call a teenage spy. De Winter sat down. This was in itself remarkable. After all, Major, you haven't offered him a seat. Forgive me, sir, he began, but are you saying that the British managed to smuggle a spy on board? A child? Exactly. And you knew? And you knew? I know everything, Captain De Winter. But why? De Winter had completely forgotten his earlier fear. Somewhere in the back of his mind, it occurred to him that he had never spoken to Major Yu so familiarly or for such a length of time. It amused me, he replied. This boy is rather full of himself. He travelled to Jakarta and disguised himself as a refugee. His mission was to infiltrate my Snakehead, but all along I knew who he was, and I was simply choosing the moment. When I would bring his young life to a fitting end, I have friends who wanted me to do it sooner rather than later, but the timing was my choice. You poured himself some more tea. He picked up a shortbread biscuit, holding it between his gloved fingers, and dipped it into the cup. My intention was to allow him to travel as far as Darwin, he continued. I was going to deal with him then. Unfortunately, the old man was unable to tell me how he managed to break out of the container, and it's certainly an unwelcome surprise. But I am still confident that you will be able to locate him eventually. After all, we have plenty of time. The Dutchman felt his mouth go dry. I am afraid not, sir, he muttered. In fact, it may already be too late. Major Yu's eyebrows rose behind the round wire frames. Why is that? Look out the window, sir. We've arrived. Look out the window, sir. We've arrived at Darwin. They've already sent out a couple of tugs to tow us in. Surely we can delay docking for a few more hours. No, sir. No, sir. If we do that, we could be stuck here for a week. De Winter ran a hand over his jaw. The Australian ports run like clockwork, he explained. Everything has to be precise. We have an allocated time for arrival, and it's a small window. If we miss it, another ship will take our place. You considered. Something very close to anxiety appeared in his shrunken, schoolboy face. This is exactly what Zeljanka had warned him about. In London, like it or not, Alex Ryder had taken on Scorpia once before and beaten them. You could have thought it impossible that such a thing could happen in a second time. And yet the boy did seem to have the luck of the devil. How had he managed to get out of the container? It was a shame nobody had been able to understand the old man before he had died. Even if we dock, the boy can't possibly leave the ship, De Winter said. There's only one exit, the main gangway, and that will be guarded at all times. He can jump into the sea, but I will have men on lookout. We can cover every angle with rifles. We'll pick him off in the water, a single shot. No one will hear anything. We'll only be in Darwin for a few hours. Our next port is Rio de Janeiro. We have 3 weeks to flush him out. Major Yu nodded slowly. Even as De Winter had been speaking, he had made up his mind. In truth, he had little choice. Royal Blue had to be disembarked immediately in order to continue its journey. He couldn't wait, but there was something that Alex Ryder didn't know. Whatever happened, all the cards were in Yu's hands. Very well, Captain, he muttered. We'll tie up at Darwin, but if the boy does slip through your fingers a second time, I suggest you kill yourself. He snapped a biscuit in half. It will spare me the trouble, and it will, I assure you, cause you a great deal less pain. Alex Ryder had heard everything that Major Yu had said. The man who had sat on the executive board of Scorpia and who was in charge of the most powerful snakehead in Southeast Asia would be horrified to know that Alex was hiding in perhaps the most obvious place in the world, under his own bed. Alex had known what he was up against. The moment he had seen the refugee killed on the deck, and he had heard you give the order for the crew to hunt him down, he had realized he had needed to find someone on the ship where nobody would even dream of looking. It was true, there were hundreds of hiding places, ventilation shafts, the crawl spaces between the containers, cabins, cable housings, and storage units. But none of these would be good enough. Not with the entire crew searching for him non-stop through the night. No, it had to be somewhere completely unthinkable, and the idea had to come to him almost at once. Where was the last place he would go? It had to be the captain's cabin, or better still, Major Yu's own quarters. The crew almost certainly wouldn't be allowed in either. It wouldn't even occur to them to look inside. He only had a few minutes head start as the crew members organised themselves from the variation. Listening devices were handed out. Alex. Racing. The layout of the ship was fairly easy to understand. He'd seen much of it already. The engine room and the crew's cabins were somewhere down below. The captain and the senior officers Anyone important would surely be housed above sea level, somewhere in the central block. Breathless, imagining the crewmen fanning out behind him, Alex stumbled on a door that led to one of the spotlessly clean, brightly lit doors that he had explored. It was on the right track. The first door he came to after that opened into a conference room full of charts and computers. Next came a living space with a bar and TV. Here the clatter of saucepans and ducked back as a man wearing a chef's hat suddenly crossed the corridor and disappeared into a room opposite. A moment later he emerged again and went back the way he had come, carrying a box of canned food. Alex hurried forward. The chef had clearly entered some sort of larder, and Alex wasted a few seconds putting out a bottle of water for himself. He was going to need it. Continuing down the corridor, he passed a laundry, a games room, a miniature hospital, and finally, a lift. There were 6 floors on the library in Star. Alex noticed the numbers as he ran past. He came upon Yu's stateroom at the very end of the corridor. It wasn't locked, but there wasn't a man on board the library in Star who would have dared enter it, even if the door had been open. And you miles away. Alex slipped inside. He saw a desk with a number of files and documents spread across the surface and wished he had time to examine them. But he didn't dare touch anything. Moving even one page, a fraction of an inch, might give him away. He looked around, taking in the pictures on the walls, scenes of English countryside with in one image a traditional hut setting out across what might be Salisbury Plain. A sophisticated stereo system and a plasma TV, a leather sofa. This was where Yu worked and relaxed when he was on board. The bedroom was next door. Here was another bizarre touch. Yu slept in an antique 4-poster bed, but Alex knew at once that it was perfect for his needs. There was a silk valance that fell down to the floor, and lifting up, he saw a space 1/2 meter high that would conceal him perfectly. It reminded him of being 7 years old again, playing hide and seek with Jack on Christmas Eve. But this wasn't the same. This time he was on a container ship in the middle of the Indian Ocean, surrounded by people who wouldn't think twice about killing him. Same game, different rules. Alex took a swig of water. he had stolen and slid under the bed. Easing the silk valance back in position, very little light bled through. He prepared himself, trying to find a comfortable position. He knew he wouldn't be able to move a muscle once you entered the room. He was suddenly struck by the craziness of this plan. Could he really stay here all night? How stupid would he look if you found him? He was briefly tempted to call out and find somewhere else, but it was already too late. The search would have begun, and he couldn't risk starting again. In fact, it was several hours before you came in. Alex heard the outer door open and close again. Footsteps, then music. You had turned on the stereo system. His taste was classic. Elgar's Pomp and Circumstance. The music they played at the Albert Hall in London every summer. He listened to the piece while he ate his dinner. Alex heard one of the stewardess deliver it to him and caught a faint scent of roast meat. The smell made him hungry. He sipped a little more water, glumly reflecting that it was all he had to take last the night. Later, you turned on the television. Somehow, he managed to tune into the BBC, and Alex heard the late-night news. The pop singer, Rob Goldman, was in Sydney this week before the conference taking place on Reef Island, which has been nicknamed Reef Encounter, and which is scheduled to take place at exactly the same time as the G8 summit in Rome. Goldman played to a packed-out Sydney Opera House and told an enthusiastic crowd that peace and an end to world poverty was possible, but that they would have to be achieved by people, not politicians. Speaking from 10 Downing Street, the British Prime Minister said he wished Sir Rob every success, but insisted that the real work would be done in Rome. It's a view not many people seem to share. Much later, Major U went to bed. Alex barely breathed as he came into the bedroom, lying in the semi-darkness with muscles that were already aching. He heard the Major undress and wash in the adjoining bathroom, and then came the inevitable moment, the creak of wood and shifting metal springs as you climbed into bed, just inches above the boy he was so determined to find. Fortunately, he didn't read before going to sleep. Alex heard the click of a light switch, and the last glimmer of light was extinguished. Then everything was silent. For Alex, the night was yet another long, dreary ordeal. He was fairly sure that Major U was asleep, but he couldn't be certain, and he didn't dare sleep himself in case the sound of his breathing or an accidental movement gave him away. All he could do was wait, listening to the hum of the engines and feeling the pitch of the ship as they drew ever closer to Australia. At least that was one consolation. Every second that he remained undiscovered brought him a little closer to safety. But how was he going to get off the library and start? On exit, guarded decks watched. Alex didn't like the idea of diving overboard and swimming, even assuming he could manage it without being crushed or drowned. There would be a dozen or more men waiting to take a pot shot at him. Well, he would just have to worry about that when the time came. The ship ploughed out on through the darkness. Minutes dragged past. At last, the first streak of light came across the floor, pushing away the shadows of the night. You woke up, washed, dressed and took his breakfast in the stateroom. That was the worst part for Alex. He had barely moved for 10 hours. Part for Alex. He had barely moved 10 hours and all his bones were aching. Still, Yu refused to leave. He was working at his desk. Alex heard the rustle of pages turning and briefly the rattle of computer keys. And then the steward brought tea and shortbread. And soon after that, De Winter arrived with the news of failure. So Major Yu knew who he was and had known from the start. Alex tucked that information away, hoping he would be able to make sense of it later. For now, all that mattered was that his plan had worked. They were docking at Darwin. Surely any minute now you would go out on deck to see dry land. But it was another 2 hours before you left. Alex waited until he was quite sure that he was alone, then rolled out from under the bed. He glanced into the stateroom. He had gone, but he had left some of the biscuits, and Alex wolfed them down. He tried to ease some feeling back into his muscles. He had to prepare himself. He knew that he had one chance to get away. They would set off to sea again in just a few hours' time, and he was still on board. And if he was still on board, he would be finished. He went over to the window. The Iberian Star had already berthed at the section of the port of Darwin known as the East Arm Wharf. To his dismay, Alex realized that they were still a very long way away from land. The East Arm was an artificial cement causeway stretching far out into the ocean, with the usual array of gantries, cranes and spreaders waiting to receive the ship. The ships. It was a different world from the docks of Jakarta. The docks at Jakarta, quite apart from the blinding Australian sun. Everything seemed very clean and ordered. There were 2 long rows of parked cars, and beyond them a neat modern warehouse and some gas tanks. All of them painted white. A van drove by, heading up the quay. 2 men walked past in fluorescent jackets and hard hats, even assuming Alex could get off the ship. He still wouldn't be safe. It was at least a mile to the mainland, and presumably there would be security barriers at the far end. You wouldn't dare gun him down in plain sight. That was one consolation. But however Alex looked at it, this wasn't going to be as easy as he had hoped. Even so, he couldn't wait any longer. Alex crept over to the door and opened it an inch at a time. The corridor was empty, lit by the same hard light that made it impossible to tell if it was night or day. He had already worked out a strategy based on what he had overheard in the stateroom. Everyone was waiting for him to break out. That meant that attention would be fixed on the main deck and the gangplank. So the rest of the ship was his. Right now he needed a diversion. He set out to create one. He hurried past the lift and found a staircase leading down. He could hear a deep throbbing coming from below, and guessed that he was heading the right way to the engine room. He came upon it quite suddenly. A strangely old-fashioned tangle of brass valves and silver pipes and pistons, all connected to one another in a steel framework, like an exhibition in an industrial museum. The air was hot down here. There was no natural light. The machinery seemed to stretch on for a mile, and Alex could imagine that a ship the size of the Iberian Star would need every inch of it. The control room was raised slightly above the engines, separated from them by 3 thick glass observation windows and reached by a short flight of metal stairs. Alex crept up on his hands and feet and found himself looking at a much more modern room with rows of gauges and dials, TV screens, computers and intricate switchboards. A single man sat in a high-backed chair tapping at a keyboard. He looked half asleep. He certainly wasn't expecting trouble down here. Alex saw what he was looking for. A metal cabinet about 50 meters high with thick pipes leading in and out, and a warning sign. Air supply, danger, do not cut off. He didn't know what needed the air or what would happen if it didn't get it, but the bright red letters were irresistible. He was going to find out. He reached into his pocket and took out the one-back coin the Smithers had given him. Using it would leave him with only the 10-back coin. With a bit of luck, he wouldn't be needing it. Alex watched the man in the chair for a minute, then slipped into the control room and placed the coin against the pipe, just where it entered the cabinet. The man didn't look up. The coin clicked into place, activating the charge inside. Alex tiptoed out again. He found the chewing gum packet, slid the side open and pressed the switch marked 1. The bang was very loud. To his surprise and relief, highly destructive. This explosion not only tore open the pipe, it wrecked the electrical circuits inside the cabinet. There was a series of brilliant sparks and something like white steam gushed out into the control room. The man leapt up. Another alarm had gone off and red lights were flashing all around him. Alex didn't wait to see what would happen next. He was already on his way out. Down the stairs, past the engines, and back up again. This time he took the lift, guessing that in an emergency the crew would be more likely to use the stairs. He pressed the button for the 6th floor, and the lift slid smoothly up. Alex knew where he was heading. He had seen the bridge when he was being loaded into the container at Jakarta, and had noticed that it had its own deck, a sort of balcony with a railing and a view of the entire ship. This was going to be his way off the library and Star. Once again, used guns might be pointing everywhere else, but surely they won't be pointing here. The lift reached the 6th floor, and the door slid open. To Alex's dismay, he found himself facing a squat Chinese crewman. The man was even more shocked than Alex and reacted clumsily, scrabbling for the gun that was tucked into the waistband of his trousers. That was a mistake. Alex didn't give his time to draw it, lashing out with his foot, aiming straight between the man's legs. It wasn't so much as a karate strike, more an old-fashioned kick in the groin, but it did the trick. The man gurgled and collapsed, dropping the gun, and it scooped it up and continued on his way. Now he was armed. Alarms were going off everywhere, and Alex wondered what damage he had done with the second coin. Good old Smithers. He was the one person in MI6 who had never let him down. The corridor led directly to the bridge. Alex passed through an archway, climbed 3 steps, and found himself in a narrow, curving room, surprisingly empty, and with large windows overlooking the decks, the containers, and to one side, the port. There were 2 men on duty, sitting in what could have been this dentist's chair, in front of a bank of television screens. There was a second officer that Alex hadn't seen before. The other one was Captain De Winter. He was on the telephone, talking in a voice that sounded strange and hoarse with disbelief. "It's the reefers," he was saying. "We're going to have to shut them all down. The whole ship could go up in flames." The reefers were refrigerated containers. There were 300 of them on Library and Star, storing meat, vegetables, and chemicals that needed to be transported at low temperatures. The containers themselves needed constant cooling, and Alex had smashed the pipes that provided exactly that. At the very least, he was going to cause Major U tens of thousands of pounds worth of losses, and the contents deteriorated. You might even have set the whole ship on fire. The second officer saw Alex first. He muttered something in Dutch, and De Winter looked round, the phone still in his hand. Alex raised the gun. "Put it down," he said. De Winter went pale. He lowered the phone. What did he do now? Alex realized that he had made this far without any real plan at all. "I want you to get me off this ship," he said. De Winter shook his head. "That's not possible." He was afraid of the gun, but he was even more afraid of Major U. Alex glanced at the phone. Presumably it could be connected to Darwin. "Call the police," he said. "I want you to bring them here." "I cannot do that either," De Winter replied. He looked a little sad. "There is no way I will help you, child. There's nowhere for you to go. You might as well give yourself up." I looked briefly out of the window. One of the containers bound for Australia was already being lifted off the ship, dangling on wires beneath a metal frame so huge that in comparison it seemed no bigger than a matchbox. The spreader was controlled by a man in a glass-fronted cabin high up in the air. The container rose up. In a few seconds it could swing across and down to the piles that were already mounting on the quayside. I judged the distance and the timing. Yes, he could do it. He had arrived at the bridge at exactly the right moment. He pointed the gun directly at De Winter. Get out of here! Get out of here!" he snapped. The captain stayed where he was. He didn't believe Alex had the nerve to pull the trigger. "I said get out!" Alex swung his hand and fired at a radar screen right next to the chair where De Winter was sitting. The sound of a gunshot was deafening inside the confined space. The screen shattered. Fragments of glass scattered over the work surface. Alex smiled to himself. There was another piece of expensive equipment on the Library and Star that was going to need to be replacing. De Winter didn't need telling again. He got up and hurried away from the bridge, following the second officer, who was already clambering down the stairs. Alex waited until they had gone. He knew they would call for help and come back with half a dozen armed men. But he didn't care. He had seen his way out. With a bit of luck, he'd be gone long before they arrived. The glass door led onto the outer walkway. Alex opened it and found himself about 20 meters above the nearest container, far enough to break his neck if he fell. The sea was another 30 meters below that. Diving into the water was out of the question. He could see U's men on the high. They wouldn't need to shoot him. The impact would kill him first. The container he had seen being lifted was now nearly above him, moving closer all the time as it travelled over the deck. And it climbed onto the railing in front of him and tensed himself. The container loomed over him. He jumped, not down, but up, his arms stretching out. For a moment he was suspended in space, and he wondered if he was going to make it. He remarked, trying not to imagine the crushing pain, his legs smashing into the deck if he fell. But then his hands caught hold of the lashings beneath the container, and he was being carried outwards, his legs dangling in the air, his neck and shoulder muscles screaming. The man operating the spreader couldn't see him. He was like an insect clinging to the underbelly of the container, and the youthman hadn't noticed him either. They were following orders, their eyes fixed on the deck and the sea below. Alex had thought the container was moving quickly when he was on the bridge. Now that he was desperately holding on, it seemed to take forever to reach the quay. He was certain that he was desperately holding on. It seemed to take forever to reach the quay, and he was certain that at any moment one of the men would glance up and see him. But he was already over the side of the ship, and now he saw another danger. Drop too early and he would break a leg. Leave it too late and he risked being crushed as the container was set down. And then someone saw him. He heard a yell of alarm. It was a docker on the wharf. He probably wasn't working for you, but that wouldn't matter. As far as Alex was concerned, he was just as much of a threat. Alex couldn't wait any longer. He let go of both hands and fell through the air for what seemed like an eternity. He had been hanging over a container with a tarpaulin cover. The tarpaulin provided a soft landing, even if the wind was knocked out of him as his back slammed into it. He didn't stop to recover his breath, but he rolled down and climbed down the side. As he ran down the quay, dodging behind containers, Alex tried to work out a strategy. The next few minutes were going to be vital. If he was captured by the port authorities, there was always a chance that he might be handed back to Major Yu. Or if he was locked up, you would know where to find him. Either way, Alex knew what the result would be. He would end up dead. He had to stay out of sight until he had reached the mainland itself. So long as he was on East Arm Wharf, he would never be safe. But luck was on his side. As he came round the corner of the last container tower, a pickup truck drew in front of him, the back filled with old cartons and empty petrol cans. The driver rolled down the window and yelled something at another dock worker. The man replied, and the two of them laughed. By the time the truck rumbled forward again, Alex was back in position. Was in the back, lying on his stomach, concealed among the cartons. The truck followed a railway line. The man followed a railway line curving round on the edge of the water, and stopped at a barrier as Alex had expected. But the security guards knew the driver and waved him through. The truck picked up speed. Alex lay there, feeling the warm Australian breeze on his shoulders as they drove away. He had done it. He had achieved everything that Ethan Brooke and ASIS had demanded. He had been smuggled illegally into Australia, and on the way, he had uncovered much of Major Yu's network. The Cello Trading Company in Bangkok, Unwin Toys, the Library in the Star. For that matter, if he could just reach Darwin in one piece and contact Ash, his mission would be over and he could finally go home. All he had to do was find a phone. 20 minutes later, the truck stopped. The engine cut out, and Alex heard the driver's door open and shut. Cautiously, he looked out. The port was. Cautiously, he looked out. He just reached. Cautiously, he looked out. The port was out of sight. They had parked outside a cafe, a brightly coloured wooden shack beside an empty road. It was called Jake's, and it had a hand-painted sign that read, "The best pies in Darwin." Alex was desperate for food. He had barely eaten anything for 2 days, but it was what he saw next to the cafe that mattered more to him right now. It was a public telephone. He waited until the driver had disappeared into the building, then climbed out and ran over to the phone. Apart from the last coin that Smithers had given him, he had no money. But according to Ash, he wouldn't need anything to make a call. Now what was the number? For a horrible moment, the separate digits danced in his head, refusing to come together. He forced himself to concentrate. 795. No, 759. Somehow, the full number took shape. He punched it in and waited. He'd got it right. The numbers were able to override the system, and Alex heard the connection being made. The phone rang 3 times before it answered. Yes? Alex felt a wave of relief. It was Ash's voice. Ash, it's me, Alex. Alex, thank God, where are you? I'm in Darwin, I think, or somewhere near it. There's a cafe called Jack's, about 20 minutes from the port. Stay where you are. I'm coming to get you. Are you here too? How did you get there here? A pause, then Ash replied, I'll tell you when I see you. Just watch out for yourself. I'll be with you as soon as I can. He hung up, and it was only in the silence that followed that Alex realised something was wrong. It had definitely been Ash on the phone, but he hadn't said it himself. His voice had been strained, and there had been something in that last pause. It was almost as if he had been waiting to be told what to say. Alex made a decision. He had contacted Ash first, as he had promised. But that might not be enough. He twisted his wrist and looked at the watch that Smithers had given him. They deliberately moved the hands to 11 o'clock. According to Smithers, the watch would send out a signal every 10 minutes. Ash might not be happy about it, but Alex didn't care. He wasn't going to take any more chances. He just wanted to know that MI6 were on their way. After that, he waited for Ash to arrive. Alex couldn't think what else to do. He was exhausted after 3 nights with almost no proper sleep and weak from lack of food. He crept round the side of the cafe and sat in the shade, keeping himself out of sight. It was likely that Major Yu's men were still looking for him, and apart from the knife concealed in his belt, he had no way of defending himself. He had left the gun behind on the bridge. He wished he had it with him now. 10 minutes later, the door of the cafe opened, and the driver who had brought him here came out carrying a brown paper bag. He got into the pickup truck and drove off again, leaving a plume of dust behind him. More time passed. There were flies buzzing around Alex's face, but he ignored them. The cafe seemed to be in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by scrubland and on the edge of a road with little traffic. The sun was beginning to dip down to the horizon, and Alex had to struggle not to doze off. But then he saw a car heading towards him, a black 4x4 with tinted windows. It pulled in outside the cafe. Ash got out, but he wasn't alone. He hadn't been driving. His hands were chained in front of him. His black hair was in disarray, and his shirt was torn. A streak of blood ran down the side of his face. He looked dazed. He hadn't seen Alex yet. Major Yu got out of the back of the car. He was wearing a white suit with a lavender shirt buttoned at the neck. He moved slowly, supporting himself on the walking stick. As always, his hands were gloved. At the same time, the driver and another man got out. They were taking no chances. The 3 of them surrounding Ash. Yu took out the pistol he had used to kill the old man on the library and Star He held it against Ash's hate. Alex Ryder, he called out in a thin voice filled with hate. You have 3 seconds to show yourself. Otherwise you'll see your godfather's brains all over the tarmac. I am counting now. Alex realized he wasn't breathing. They had Ash. What was he going to do? Give himself up and they would both be killed? But if he could forgive himself, if he turned and ran, 1, he regretted now that he hasn't used the phone to call ASIS, the police, anyone. He had known something was wrong. How could he have been so stupid? 2, he had no choice. Even if he tried to run, they would catch him. There were 3 of them. They had a car. He was in the middle of nowhere. He stood up, showing himself. Major Yulo with the gun, and Alex began to walk forward. Worn out and defeated. Ash must have been on the library star all the time. A prisoner like him. He seemed to be in pain. His eyes were empty. I'm sorry, Alex. Well, here you are at last. Well, here you are at last, Major Yu said. I have to say, you caused me a great deal of time and inconvenience. Go to hell. Yes, my dear Alex, he replied. That's exactly where I'm taking you. He raised the hand with the walking stick, then swung it with all his strength. This was the last thing that Alex remembered. A silver scorpion, glinting brilliantly as it swooped down towards him, out of the Australian sun. He didn't even feel it as it smashed into the side of his head. Pick him up, Yu commanded. He turned his back on the unconscious boy and climbed back into the car. That's the end of me reading you Alice Ryder, chapter 15. So goodbye everyone, and thank you for listening to this.